But here's where the official story quietly falls apart. Because if the Maya didn't vanish, if their cities emptying didn't mean their civilization ended, then everything we think we know about collapse is misleading. If their knowledge didn't disappear, if their calendars, their astronomy, their agricultural techniques, their gods, and even their social structures were inherited, refined, and passed forward, then the real mystery isn't how the Maya fell. The real mystery is why we're taught to treat it like the end of the story. History textbooks present the decline of the classic Maya as a dramatic cutoff: abandoned pyramids, empty plazas, vanished kings. But that's only one layer of the truth. Beneath it, the knowledge lived on, quietly threading through Toltec and Aztec traditions, spreading south into Andean civilizations, and surviving in the practices of millions of descendants. The collapse was surface level, the legacy endured. And that's the part almost no one teaches. And this is where modern history quietly changes the subject. Because once you acknowledge continuity, the timeline stops being convenient. If knowledge survived the Maya, if it flowed into the Toltecs, the Aztecs, and beyond, then the idea that the Americas were reset before European contact collapses instantly. Ask yourself this: why do so many later civilizations already understand complex astronomy the moment they appear in the record? Why do agricultural systems arrive fully optimized? Why do ritual calendars already function perfectly? Why do myths speak of remembering rather than discovering? Because rediscovery is faster than invention. By the time the Aztecs rose to power, they weren't experimenting. They were restoring. They rebuilt temples on older foundations. They re-established ceremonial cycles tied to dates far older than their empire. They treated knowledge as inheritance, not innovation. Even their capital, Tenochtitlan, was aligned according to principles that predated them. And they said so themselves. To the Aztecs, history wasn't a straight line. It was a wheel. Worlds rose, worlds collapsed. Survivors carried fragments forward. That worldview didn't come from nowhere. It echoes the Maya. It echoes the Olmecs. It echoes the Andes. Different cultures, same memory, which leads to a deeply uncomfortable conclusion. What if ancient Americans weren't primitive societies slowly stumbling towards civilization, but custodians of an ancient system of knowledge that outlived empires? What if collapse wasn't failure, but transition? Because when you strip away stone monuments and royal propaganda, what remains is infrastructure. Farming techniques that still feed millions, calendars that still map the sky, stories that still describe cycles modern science only recently confirmed. The Maya didn't disappear, they dispersed. Their cities fell silent, but their ideas didn't. And that forces us to rethink the most dangerous assumption in history: that progress only moves forward. Sometimes it survives sideways, passed quietly, carried orally, hidden in ritual, encoded in myth, waiting for someone to notice the pattern again. And once you do, the ancient Americas stop looking like a series of lost civilizations. They look like one long conversation, still unfinished. Ask yourself this: if the Maya truly collapsed into nothing, why did later civilizations already understand their calendar logic, their gods, their cosmic obsessions? Knowledge doesn't evaporate, it migrates, and in this case it moved north. As classic Maya power began to fracture, cities abandoned, dynasties broken, inscriptions falling silent, central Mexico was already dominated by something immense, deliberate, and eerily advanced: Teotihuacan. This wasn't just another ancient city, it was a system. No glorified kings posing on monuments, no long genealogies carved into stone. Instead, there was something far more unsettling: anonymity paired with absolute order. Teotihuacan was laid out with mathematical precision, its main avenue aligned to celestial events, its pyramids positioned with intentional cosmic symbolism, and its population, tens of thousands strong, lived in standardized apartment compounds, organized by profession, ethnicity, and ritual role. That alone should raise alarms, because cities like this don't emerge accidentally. They require planning, administration, and a governing philosophy that prioritizes structure over spectacle. And then there's the part most textbooks rush past. Teotihuacan didn't stay isolated. Maya inscriptions, written by the Maya themselves, record a moment of disruption. A foreign power arriving from the west, warriors carrying unfamiliar weapons, leaders replaced, new imagery suddenly appearing in Maya cities, Teotihuacan-style headdresses, foreign symbols carved into sacred spaces, architectural styles imported wholesale. This wasn't coincidence, it was contact. But it wasn't simple conquest either. Teotihuacan didn't erase Maya identity. They didn't burn temples or ban gods. They did something far more effective. They integrated. They layered themselves on top of existing traditions, absorbing local knowledge while reinforcing their own systems of time, ritual, and cosmic order. And when Teotihuacan itself collapsed around 550 CE, suddenly, violently, and still not fully understood, that layered knowledge didn't disappear. It scattered into successor cultures, into oral tradition, into rituals that outlived stone. So when later civilizations rise already fluent in cosmic cycles and sacred time, it's not evidence of coincidence. It's evidence of inheritance. The Maya didn't vanish. They transformed. And Teotihuacan was one of the bridges that carried their world forward. Civilizations didn't replace each other. They overlapped. And that overlap is where history becomes dangerous. Because overlap destroys the idea of a clean beginning. It suggests there was no reset button. No moment where knowledge vanished and humanity started over. After Teotihuacan fell, something else emerged from its shadow. The Toltecs. Modern history often treats them cautiously, semi-mythical, part legend, part fact. A civilization spoken about more than it's seen. But that hesitation says more about the gaps in our record than the reality of their influence. To the Aztecs, the Toltecs were not a mystery. They were the gold standard. The word Toltec didn't just mean a people, it meant an ideal, an architect, an artist, a keeper of divine knowledge. To call someone Toltec was to say they understood the universe. The Aztecs didn't pretend to invent their civilization from nothing. They didn't frame themselves as pioneers. They framed themselves as heirs. Their myths speak openly of past ages, of suns that rose and fell, of worlds destroyed and remade, of survivors carrying fragments of wisdom into the next era. This wasn't metaphor to them, it was history encoded in story. And it should sound familiar because it echoes everything we've already seen. The Maya spoke of cycles, of creation and collapse. The Olmecs hinted at transformation and continuity. Teotihuacan embedded cosmic order into stone. Different cultures, same memory. And this idea doesn't stop in Mesoamerica. In the Andes, Inca traditions speak of earlier builders, giants, sages, or forgotten peoples, who laid foundations before the Inca ever ruled. In North America, oral histories describe worlds before this one, wiped away and rebuilt. Across the ancient Americas, the same theme repeats. Knowledge survives collapse. Civilization doesn't end, it migrates. So when the Aztecs looked backward, they weren't mythologizing out of nostalgia. They were acknowledging lineage. They believed greatness came from preservation, not invention. From remembering what was already known. And that forces an uncomfortable realization. What if the mythical civilizations are only mythical because their records didn't survive conquest, climate, or time? What if the past wasn't lost, only fragmented? Because when multiple cultures, separated by centuries and geography, tell the same story, that's not coincidence. That's memory refusing to die. This is where the narrative flips. What if the Americas were never a chain of isolated civilizations, but one of the longest continuous intellectual traditions on Earth? To the Aztecs, Quetzalcoatl wasn't just a god. He was memory made divine, the same feathered serpent carved into Olmec stone, the same being worshipped by the Maya as Kukulkan, now appearing again, centuries later, under a new name. Same symbolism, same cosmic function, different language. That doesn't happen by coincidence. Gods don't survive the collapse of empires unless they represent something deeper than belief. They survive because they encode structure, a way to explain time, power, morality, and humanity's place in the universe. Quetzalcoatl wasn't just worshipped, he was referenced, studied, returned to, a civilizational constant. And this pattern doesn't stop in Mesoamerica. Far to the south, across the Andes, another story was unfolding, one that followed the same rhythm. Rise, refine, pass on. The Mochi mastered hydraulic engineering and ritual iconography. The Nazca carved geometry so vast, it only makes sense from the sky. The Wari built road systems and administrative networks long before empires were supposed to exist there. Tiwanaku aligned stone and ceremony to the movement of the sun, the seasons, and the mountains themselves. Then came the Inca, often portrayed as sudden conquerors, a rapid empire with no past. But that image collapses under scrutiny. The Inca didn't invent terrace farming. They inherited and perfected it. They didn't create sacred geography. They mapped authority onto landscapes already considered alive. Mountains weren't scenery, they were ancestors. And just like the Maya, the Inca spoke of earlier worlds, previous creations, ages that ended in catastrophe and renewal. The same story, different mountains, different names, same memory. And once you see that continuity, the civilizations stop looking isolated. They start looking connected, not by conquest, but by inheritance. A chain of knowledge stretching across centuries, refusing to break. Across two continents, civilizations that never contacted each other, told the same story, not one beginning, but many cycles. That alone should make us pause, because when independent cultures, separated by mountains, jungles, and oceans, describe history the same way, rise, collapse, renewal, it stops looking like myth and starts looking like memory. This raises a dangerous question. If ancient American civilizations understood history as cyclical, why are we taught to see it as linear? Why does the story always move forward in straight lines, discovery, progress, collapse, with no room for return, refinement, or inheritance? Because linear history is clean. Cyclical history is unsettling. Linear narratives allow us to say a civilization failed and move on. Cyclical narratives force us to ask what survived. And that's where things get uncomfortable. Inheritance complicates the myth of primitive societies reacting blindly to nature. It suggests something far more deliberate. That ancient people weren't just adapting, they were observing, tracking patterns across generations, testing ideas, correcting errors, preserving what worked. Knowledge didn't disappear when cities fell. It migrated through priesthoods, through oral tradition, through ritual, architecture, and symbolism designed to outlast language itself. The Maya weren't a historical fluke. They weren't an isolated burst of brilliance in the jungle. They were a node, a convergence point where inherited astronomy, mathematics, theology, and engineering aligned with rare precision. A moment where ancient knowledge became visible enough to impress modern observers. And when that clarity fractured, through drought, political stress, and social change, it didn't evaporate. It dispersed into central Mexico, into the Toltec worldview, into Aztec cosmology, southward into Andean traditions that echoed the same logic of cycles, ages, and cosmic resets. Civilizations fell, but understanding didn't. What collapsed was the surface. What endured was the structure beneath it. And once you recognize that, the story of the ancient Americas stops being a tale of vanished peoples. It becomes something far more unsettling. A long conversation, interrupted, fragmented, but never truly lost. So what really happened after the Maya? They didn't vanish. They decentralized. When the great classic Maya cities began to empty, it wasn't a sudden extinction or an apocalyptic collapse. Palaces were abandoned, stelae stopped being carved, and dynasties lost their grip on power, but the people didn't disappear with the monuments. Cities emptied, yes, but communities remained. Families moved outward into smaller settlements. Power fractured, but life continued. Languages survived, ritual calendars persisted, agricultural knowledge endured, maize cycles were still tracked, sacred days were still observed. The same astronomical logic that once aligned pyramids to the sun continued to guide planting, harvesting, and ceremony. The knowledge didn't need stone temples anymore, it lived in people. This is the part history often skips. Millions of Maya descendants were still living across Mesoamerica when Europeans arrived. They weren't relics of a vanished world, they were active participants in one that had adapted. And they're still there today, speaking Maya languages, practicing traditions rooted in ancient cosmology, carrying forward ideas that predate the rise of kings and the fall of cities, which makes the phrase lost civilization deeply misleading. Nothing was lost, it was ignored, because Western history has a bias. It looks for stone, for empires, for centralized power. When those disappear, the story ends. But Maya civilization didn't depend on constant monument building to survive. Once political centers collapsed, the knowledge simply changed form. It became decentralized, embedded in ritual, agriculture, and oral tradition instead of architecture. And that's where the real forbidden history begins. Not in dramatic collapse, but in quiet continuity. Ancient knowledge survived without pyramids to announce it, without inscriptions to impress archaeologists, without kings demanding remembrance. It survived because it was useful, because it worked, because it helped people understand time, land, seasons, and their place in the universe. And that leads us to the most uncomfortable possibility of all. If civilizations inherit knowledge, if ideas survive even when empires fall, then how much of human history has been misread simply because we were trained to look for endings instead of connections? We mark collapse as failure, but collapse can also be transformation. The Maya weren't the beginning. They weren't the end. They were a chapter. One moment where ancient knowledge became visible enough to leave monuments behind. Before them, that knowledge was forming. After them, it was carried quietly forward, unrecorded by stone, but no less real. And beneath every civilization we think we understand, there may be another. Older, quieter, forgotten by name, yet still shaping the world long after its monuments crumbled. That's the story they didn't teach you. And once you see it, you can't unsee it.